Often as part of routine systems administration of Windows Server 2003, you'll want to be able to monitor the system to make sure that everything's running properly. In this exercise, we're going to use the Performance Monitor tool to be able to see how the system is performing. So let's start by clicking on the Start button, going to Programs, Administrative Tools, and then we'll click on the Performance tool. Now this will open up the Performance tool with the basic counters that are already added. So you'll notice that memory pages per second, physical disk average disk queue length, and the processor time are added by default to the system. I'll go ahead and click the Add button to add some new counters so we can monitor additional information about the performance of this server. You'll notice that within the Add dialog box that there's a few options here. First of all, you can choose from which computer you want to view information. In this case, I'll just go ahead and choose the local computer, but I could specify another machine on the network. The actual statistics that you're going to monitor are organized into objects which are major groupings, for example, processor, logical disk, physical disk, etc. And each object will have one or more counters that you can choose from. So you can choose which specific information you want. For example, for processor, I want to see what percentage of time the processor is actually in use. And then finally, for certain types of objects, there are instances that are available. So for example, I can choose on a multiple CPU machine which CPU I want to monitor. In this case, there's only one CPU in this computer, so there's only two options, the total option and the option to monitor that CPU individually. Another useful feature is the Explain button, which pops up a little dialog box that shows you information about what that particular statistic actually measures. So this can be useful if you're actually wondering what some of the short names mean in the list of counters. I'm going to start by adding some items from the logical disk object. Specifically, I want to view percent disk time. I'll go ahead and choose the total instance here. And I'll click the Add button to add that to the counter. You'll notice that down at the bottom, this has automatically been added to the system monitor graph that we were viewing earlier. I also want to monitor percent free space. So I'll choose that option and I'll choose total again and click Add. Next we'll move to the memory counter, and we want to add available megabytes, which shows how much available space is available in the memory cache. Next we'll go to network interface, and I'll choose bytes total per second. Here's an example of where there's a couple of options for instances. In this case, I'm going to choose my wireless network adapter and click the Add button. Continuing on, I'll choose the object, and choose processes. And this will show me the number of processes that are running currently on the system. We've got a few more left to go, so I'll go to paging file. And I'll choose percent usage. Notice that if I had multiple paging files, I could choose which ones I wanted to monitor. But in this case, I'll just go ahead and choose the total option. Finally, we'll add 3 counters from the server object. So I'll add bytes total per second, the number of files open, and finally the logon total, which will show me how many people are logged onto the server over the network. Finally, when I'm done adding these counters, I'll click the Close button. You'll notice that all the counters that I've added are now show up in the list. All of the data that we're viewing here is being collected live, so these are the latest statistics. For example, you'll notice that the processor time on this computer is being used fairly heavily. A useful option is to click this Highlight button, which will allow you to highlight the option that you've chosen. And there's some very useful statistics here. For example, you can see the last value, for example, how much the CPU utilization was on the last poll, the average value over the entire collection time, which in this case is 1 minute and 40 seconds, the minimum, and the maximum. In addition to viewing information in this graph view, which is really helpful for tracking information over time, I can also choose to view a histogram, which is basically a vertical bar chart that shows the latest values. Now this doesn't show information about the current values over time, but it does show the latest statistics for the various pieces of information that I'm tracking. Similarly, I can take a look at the report view, which shows me the data numerically. So for example, if I want to get exact values for percent free space or percent disk time, I can get that right here. Now let's switch back to the graph view so we can view the information that we were looking at earlier. Now it can take a little bit of time to be able to figure out what to monitor on your servers. So once you do it, you want to be able to save that information so you can look at it later. So let's do that by right-clicking on the graph area and choosing the Save As option. This allows me to create a new web page. I'm going to go ahead and store it in my eData folder. And I'll call it System Performance Monitoring. Now notice that the actual file is going to be saved as a web page in an HTML format. I can also choose to save this information in a tab-separated values text file. However, I'm going to go ahead and choose the default option of a web page and click the Save button. Now that we've created the HTML file, let's go ahead and take a look at that in a web browser. So I'll go ahead and navigate to the folder in which I stored my file, and I'll double-click on the System Performance Monitoring.html file. And this is going to launch a display that looks very similar to the performance monitor that we were looking at before. Notice that it includes the information about performance statistics in the graphical view. However, the data is not being updated. So this is actually the data that was saved at the time that I actually saved the HTML file. I could easily uncheck this Freeze Display button to start viewing live information through a web browser. It tells me that this will erase all the data that's in the graph and it'll start fresh and showing new information. So I'll go ahead and click Yes to continue. And again, we'll be collecting new live information. So with a little imagination, you can see how this would be a great way to create a server monitor dashboard that's just a simple web page that systems administrators can use to monitor all of your servers from one location. I'll go ahead and close the web browser. And I'll close the System Performance tool. Now we'll be using this data file that we created in the HTML format. We'll be using that in a later exercise.